Serin. I'm Director of Listings Development with the Canadian Securities Exchange, and welcome to our weekly market recap with Bruce Campbell from StoneCastle Investment Management. Thank you for joining us this week, Bruce.
Yeah, week number 3, here we go.
Week number 3, and apparently we have some international viewers, which is great. So, make sure that if you want to see this update every week, go to our CSC TV and make sure you hit the subscribe button, and you can see the weekly market updates as they come out. Yet another big week in the markets. We're going to talk about a few things. One, the massive market volume that we saw in the Canadian capital markets this week. We're also going to talk about, because it wouldn't be a week without talking about some short squeezing, we're going to talk about cannabis and what happened in the markets, both in the US and in Canada. And we're going to end off with the big topic of the week, which was the big purchase of Bitcoin by Tesla and what that meant for the markets and for Bitcoin. So why don't we jump right into it? Bruce, let's talk about the market volume that we saw in Canada.
Yeah, so this week we saw a huge volume really across the board, both in Canada and the US. Obviously a lot of that was driven by, some of the things that have been going on and that we'll talk about later. Obviously, cannabis is one big one for sure, but, we're seeing that really across the board. We're seeing a lot of participation. We continue to see, multiple sectors that, see money flow coming into the markets. And in a lot of cases, it's money flow that's coming in from outside of Canada. So you're seeing foreign investors actually looking at Canada and taking a position in Canadian companies or Canadian listed companies.
Well, it's pretty exciting for us in Canada because, we're relatively small in capital market space. So to have that foreign investment, I think is amazing for us. I will say on the CSE, we continuously broke records in volume throughout the week. I think our largest day was February 10th. We traded over 720 million shares. That was a big day for us. So that was pretty exciting. As well, CSE issuers in January actually broke some records on raising capital. Collectively, they raised over $1.482 billion, which was pretty incredible. Let's move on. We're going to talk about cannabis. We can't, like I said, have a week without talking about short squeezing. What happened with cannabis this week?
Yeah, I mean, we really saw we saw a really wild week this week. Obviously, you touched on the volume, and obviously that a lot of that would have been cannabis and probably, if you sort of dug into the volume on your exchange in particular, a lot of it would have been cannabis, especially with the large MSOs that trade on your exchange. So what we saw is, sort of a carryover of what we saw from the GameStop, where, you have people taking a look at short interest, and there's a lot of short interest on Canadian stocks. And so then they started to really force those shorts to cover. And what happened is the stocks rocketed up, and we had a huge day on Wednesday. There were some stocks that were up, 30-40% on one day. And then really the next day it was a function of, if it went up, it had to go down. And, yesterday we saw record volume, well, maybe not record volume, but high volume on a lot of stocks. And we saw huge down days. There were some that we saw that were down as much as 50% on the day. So, you put your money in the day before and you lost half of your capital. So really just shows you how important it is. And I mean, obviously we didn't really have any of that type of experience with the clients or with the stocks in our portfolio, but anytime you're going in and out, you want to be legging in and out, both to buy and to sell, because especially in a volatile market like cannabis, probably the only other one that's as volatile would be Bitcoin, which we'll talk about in a minute. So yeah, it was definitely interesting. Today seems like it's settled down a little bit. You're seeing some follow through in names that probably sold off a little too much yesterday, and there's still some names that are down today. But it's certainly more orderly than it was on Wednesday or yesterday.
Now, can you touch a little bit on what happened across the border? Because I think what we're seeing across the border is there is some discussion around what happened with U.S. investors and mainly focused on Canadian LPs. Why was that interaction happening this week?
Yeah. So what you saw is that if you look at, from a valuation perspective, you look at from an earnings perspective, the Canadian stocks are certainly more expensive than the US. And then if you look at the fact that the US has a significantly larger total addressable market at this point in time, I mean, there's some thought that the Canadian companies could come into the US, but right now, if you just purely look at Canada versus the US, it's 10 times the size in the US that it is in Canada. So you're getting a lot of people who have been moving money into the big MSOs in the US and some of the smaller niche companies as well. And they've looked at Canada and said, well, if we want to hedge our portfolio, how do we do that? Well, we do it by shorting Canadian companies. And then if the whole cannabis sector as a whole drops, then we'll be in pretty decent shape because we have some longs versus some shorts, and kind of everything is going to work out. But of course, is what's happened with this sort of Reddit phenomena, the Reddit rebellion, is that now you're seeing where they specifically target these companies that have a high short volume, and it's forcing those prices up. So we really saw that. And then of course what happened was yesterday morning pre-market, a lot of those names in the cannabis sector, both Canada and the US, were up. And then there was an article on Barron's talking about how this was going to be the GameStop moment for the cannabis sector. And almost on a dime, the stocks turned and immediately started selling off. And by the time the market opened, they opened down, and then it just never stopped. It just kept going from there. And volume picks up more volume, and selling picks up more selling, and it was just everyone was sort of piling on. We took the chance to took the opportunity to add to some of our holdings that we think got indiscriminately sold down. So it was we thought it was great.
Well, and usually that's when the fund managers such as yourself see the opportunity, right, is in those moments. And I think it's important to clarify, we've talked about this before, but US MSOs, if they're touching a plant, they cannot be listed on an exchange in the US. That's why we're seeing so many of them come to Canadian markets, whereas Canadian LPs, the big ones, because they're in a legal jurisdiction of Canada, they're allowed to list on US stock exchanges. Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's, where some of these US investors can only get access because they can't trade in some of the Canadian exchanges, or they have difficulty sort of interacting with their brokers on the Canadian exchanges. So it makes it easier for them if they can just go to NASDAQ and buy, a Canadian cannabis company, and they're kind of using that as a proxy for investing in cannabis when, it really isn't what, they probably want to be doing.
Well, they're just very different markets. It's an interesting inversion that we're seeing happen. The one thing that I noticed actually in the cannabis space especially was a few of our CSE issuers had some pretty big short form prospectuses that they were filed in January. We saw Curaleaf do one about 317 million. And in February, we saw Trulieve do one that was, I think, 750 million, which is so great to see that, their ability to raise this capital has come back to the markets. And these are big companies. Can you tell our viewers what is a short form prospectus or a shelf prospectus?
Yeah, so basically they go through, all the legal and regulatory work to file a prospectus that isn't necessarily being used, but it's, as it says, it's on the shelf there to be used, and they can, pull it down at some future date when they decide it's time to raise money, and then they can just, they basically go directly to the market. And by doing that, it opens it up to a lot more investors. The alternative to that would be if they decided to do a private placement, which typically is just for those accredited investors, which are, they have to meet certain criteria in order to be accredited by either income or, size of your net worth or financial portfolio. So it just opens things up to a lot more individuals. And, in a lot of cases too, it also opens up the opportunity, sort of cross border, because of, if they file it properly, it allows them to do that as well.
Well, I'm also a big fan of, any financing that involves a prospectus, because it allows money to go directly into the company, into their treasury, and allows them to build out their business plan, which is great from my perspective. I like seeing issuers have that ability to move forward. Okay, well, let's jump into it. Let's talk about the elephant in the room, which was the Bitcoin purchase by Tesla. Tell us what happened.
Yeah, so obviously, sort of halfway through the week, we got this announcement that Tesla had invested into Bitcoin. It's been on fire lately, so in some ways, it's not that surprising. There's a number of different theories out there on sort of why it was done. The official theory or the official reason was that it was for a diversifying cash management tool, which certainly could be part of the case. There's also a thought that as Tesla as a company starts to accept Bitcoin as a form of payment, then, they need to obviously have, that petty cash, which in this case seems like a lot, in their tills, so that they basically are able to, do transactions and, take it in and then send it out and do transactions in Bitcoin. So it's, could be a combination of both, bit of diversification, and then also, allow them to start to transact on Bitcoin. The effect obviously was, it garnered a lot of interest. Bitcoin continued to go up, and I mean it's certainly at some fairly high levels here, especially if you sort of look at it where it was last year when it bottomed out, or even if you looked at it sort of 3 or 4 or 5 years ago.
Yeah. 2018 it really bottomed out, right?
It did, yeah. Well, it had that big run, and then it pulled back quite significantly after that.
Which, if you can believe it or not, Bruce, was 3 years ago, which I'm trying to wrap my head around. There's a few things about this that I find intriguing and I think are of value for people to really question. First of all, there's no way that Elon didn't think that he would make this kind of a move and not affect, the price of Bitcoin. I mean, that was just a natural. All of his advisors and him knew exactly what it was going to do there. I think the background idea is that, typically you don't need a float when you're dealing with perhaps US currency. When you're taking US currency to sell your vehicle, you don't really need a float because there's a bit more volatility within this currency. He really is creating his own float. So I think that's a pragmatic view of it. I think he did do some type of social media element to it before the purchase happened. So I wonder if the SEC will be knocking on his door and asking a few questions.
He doesn't seem to have trouble with the SEC. If you think about what he did last year with Tesla, he just sort of like pushed them away.
You might have some friends. But here's the other thing is that it also created a bit of a short squeeze, didn't it?
Oh yeah, it sure did for sure. I mean, people were garnering it.
Well, because and here's the thing, because the currency itself has so much volatility, there is a lot of short selling within Bitcoin. So, that surge in price, yet again, it's, I guess, the year of the short squeeze, Bruce.
Yeah, the year of the sort of Reddit rebellion short squeeze. It's interesting because that's from an institutional basis, that's something that people have looked at for years is short interest in stocks, and now it's kind of right in the forefront. People are like targeting stocks that have a high short interest now, which is very interesting.
Well, it's also a very sophisticated maneuver. And again, I just hope that unsophisticated investors aren't adding this to their investment plan without some guidance.
Yeah, especially when you see the moves. I mean, you just think about the GameStop. Like if you had bought it a couple of weeks ago, you're down quite significantly from where sort of the highs were, and even some of the midweek moves that it made were fairly significant. So again, if you think that it just only goes one way, it certainly doesn't.
One thing I read, because I was doing a bit of research myself leading up to this conversation, one thing I found interesting that I didn't realize is, this digital currency world that we live in, is that to create the functionality of it, it actually uses an incredible amount of fossil fuel. I read somewhere that just Bitcoin alone as a currency uses more fossil fuel than the entire country of Argentina in a year, which I thought was really interesting. And it was saying that as the value of Bitcoin goes up, more fossil fuel gets used to be able for the miners to confirm, its currency, right?
Yeah, that's an interesting stat for sure. I'm sure there's not too many people that give that really any thought, and especially there's talk of kind of the next generation of investor looking at carbon footprint and things like that, and yet they probably haven't really thought through all the consequences and ramifications of this.
Absolutely. I do know that Elon did I think he's put about 100 million aside for people to try and create a less carbon or a more efficient way of mining Bitcoin. So obviously he's trying to hedge that as well. Speaking of which, let's talk about energy. There was some stuff happening in the energy space this week.
Yeah, for sure. As you see, you continue to see the price of energy bottom and now move up. Now you're starting to see the M&A activity pick up. So, we saw a deal this week between ARC and 7Gen, and then we also saw a deal for IPL. So, one of the things that we've started to see is that we've seen this shift in, change in some of the market trends. And one of those trends is that, US versus the rest of the world, we're seeing this trend where, now it looks like it might be reversing. We've had this fairly significant run in the US for the last, probably call it 5 years. And now it looks like, countries like Canada and a lot of the emerging countries and resource countries are now starting to take over from a relative strength standpoint as far as just pricing goes. So we're starting to see that in Canada. We're seeing that, all the energy stocks have moved up. Helps obviously with the banking stocks. They've moved up, and the commodity stocks, not so much, maybe the precious metals, but certainly the base metal stocks are all, hitting highs with copper up where it is. So it's, kind of an interesting turn in the markets. You're not hearing as much, sort of value growth talk, but it's certainly there and happening for sure.
Well, it's nice to see that that's joining along the rest of the sectors.
Yeah, I mean, it just broadens out the diversification and broadens out the markets. And, one thing that, lots of people can point out here is sentiment's really high and really stretched. If you look at, something like the put call ratio, or if you look at the National Association of Active Investment Managers, it's extended as well. But, that might mean that we might have a short-term top in the markets, but you don't typically see long-term tops when the breadth is so broad and you see, multiple sectors, multiple market caps, all really with market flow and dollars moving into those areas.
That's great. That's great news. One thing I want to point out before we wrap up, and Bruce, I hope you have a wonderful long weekend with your children. The markets are closed Monday, right?
That's right. Yeah, we got a break. Get to sleep in.
So it's Family Day weekend. I hope everyone has a great weekend. Thank you so much, Bruce, again. I love these weekly market updates and can't wait till next week.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Have a great weekend.
You too.